this Technique Tuesday video, I'll demonstrate several ways to create spiral hat crown decreases. This type of hat crown can spiral right or left. The spirals can be distinct and really stand out, or they can be more subtle. I'll give you an overview of the process, go through several examples of how to plan and calculate for these types of crowns, and then I'll discuss ways to modify the crown outcomes based on your preferences. So I want to give you a little overview of this particular hat crown. The spiral hat crown is typically worked over the top 1/3 of the hat. The stitches on the needle are divided into equal sections. Usually there's somewhere between 6 and 10 sections. 8 is really common. When a decrease round is worked, one decrease is worked in each of those sections. And the decrease is worked in the same place in each section and in the same place for every decrease round. It's that stacking of the decreases in the same location that causes this spiraling effect. Decrease rounds are typically alternated with plain rounds for most, if not all, of the crown. Sometimes you will have the last few decrease rounds worked sequentially without any plain rounds. When you look at the way that the spirals appear, you can see that in this red hat, there are some really defined lines that are dividing each section. But in this purple hat here, you can see that there are spirals, but they are a lot more subtle. For this first example, we're going to assume that the total length of the hat is 8 inches in length. As I mentioned, the crown of the hat is typically worked over the top third. It can be a little longer or a little less, but 1/3 is typical. So an 8-inch hat divided by 3 would mean that the hat crown is about 2.7 inches. So you need to figure out how many rounds that hat crown is actually going to be. And you do that by multiplying the length of the crown by your row gauge. So at this point, you will have knit 5.3 inches worth of hat, and you can lay a ruler down on the hat and you can measure how many rows you get per inch, and you can multiply it. So let's assume in this example that we are getting 7 rounds per inch. That equals 18.9 rounds, and of course we have to work full rounds. We can't work 18.9 rounds. So this hat crown is going to be 19 rounds in length. The next thing you need to do is to figure out how many sections that you're going to have for your crown. I have 100 stitches on the needle, so it's really easy for me to just divide this into 10 equal sections. So I've got a marker for every 10 stitches on the needle. I place a different color marker to mark the end of round, beginning of the round, so that when it's time to do a decrease round, you know when to start, and then you also know when to finish. The last thing we need to plan for in our hat crown is whether we want these really defined lines of decreases that separate each section of the crown, or if we want our spirals to be more subtle, like in this purple hat. As we calculated earlier, we have a 2.7-inch crown. We have 7 rounds per inch, so we're going to be working for 19 rounds. We divided our hat into 10 sections of 10 stitches each, and we are going to be reducing those 10 stitches down to 1 over the course of the crown decreases, which means we will be working 9 decrease rounds. So the 19 total rounds for the crown minus the 9 decrease rounds means that we will be working 10 plain rounds that we need to distribute. So I have kind of a generic chart here. We do not need a setup round for our hat, and we are going to be working 9 decrease rounds, so we don't have that. We do not work a plain round after our final decrease round. As soon as you work your last decrease round, you fasten off the live stitches. So we need to distribute these 10 plain rounds. So for sure we can work one plain round after each of the decrease rounds, but we've only used up 8 and we need to distribute 10. So we can put an extra plain round after each of these first decrease rounds at the base of the crown. So anytime you have to distribute extra plain rounds, start distributing them at the base of the crown rather than at the top of the crown. The last thing we need to decide is whether we want really defined decrease lines for our spirals or if we want something subtle. So if we want something defined like we see in this red crown, then what we are going to do is work knit 2 together at the end of each section when we're working a decrease round. So as we work a decrease round, we're going to work across all of the stitches until 2 remain, and then we're going to work our knit 2 together. Then we slip the marker, and we do the same thing for the next section. We work all the way across until 2 stitches remain, and then we work a knit 2 together. So this is how every single decrease round is going to be worked. You're going to work across all of the stitches in a given section until 2 remain, and then you will work those 2 stitches together. And it's working a knit 2 together at the end of every section and then stacking them up over the course of the crown that causes that really defined decrease line. So let's do another example. In this one, we're going to have a hat that is 9 inches long, and so the top third of that is going to be 3 inches. In this case, let's say we have a row gauge that we have measured in our hat that is 6.5 rounds per inch. In this case, we're going to end up with 19.5 rounds, which means we need to round it up to 20. So the length of this hat crown is going to be 20 rounds. Sometimes you just can't divide the stitches that you have on the needles into a number of sections that's going to work. Either that you just can't divide evenly, or you might want a very specific number of sections and that number doesn't divide into the number that you have on the needles. So in the previous example, I had 100 stitches that I divided into 10 equal sections, but I might not actually want 10 sections. Maybe I decide I'd really prefer having 8 spirals going around the top of my head, but I can't divide 8 evenly into 100. It goes into 112 times, but there is a remainder of 4 stitches. So what I need to do is work a setup round that eliminates those 4 stitches. What I will do is I will plan my 8 sections knowing that I want to start off with 12 in each one. And then I will plan to have 4 sections that start out with an extra stitch. So I'm going to distribute these sections that have extra stitches evenly as I can. I don't want them all bunched down on the same side of the hat, so I distribute them out. So what you can see is I'm going to start out with 8 sections where I'm alternating a section of 12 with a section of 13 all the way around. And when I work my setup round, I'm only going to be working decreases in the sections that have that extra stitch. And then once the setup round is complete, every section will have 12 stitches. I've set up my hat right here. I've got orange markers marking off each section. So here I've got my 12 stitches and my marker, and here I've got 13. And then I just put a different color marker in the fabric so that as I'm working the setup round, I am reminded of whether or not I need to be working a decrease in this round. So I've distributed 12 stitches, 13, and then placed a marker to remind me, and so on all the way around. So let's go through and plan out our crown. Well, as we looked at before, I have a 3-inch crown and I have 6.5 rounds per inch. That's 19.5 rounds. So I've established that my total crown will be 20 rounds in length. I have 12 stitches in each of the sections when I start. which means I'll have 11 decrease rounds. But before I get to having 12 stitches in each section, I have to work a setup round. So I have 20 rounds total. I'm going to subtract my decrease rounds, which is 11, but I also have to subtract the setup round. So I actually have to subtract 12 rounds altogether, and that means I have 8 plain rounds. So if we look at the setup this time, I have the setup round plus 11 decrease rounds, and I have to distribute 8 plain rounds. We don't work a plain round after the setup round. Those are just worked consecutively. So we're going to distribute those 8 plain rounds after each of the first 8 decrease rounds, but then we won't have any more plain rounds to work, so we aren't going to work a plain round after any of those rounds. These final 3 decrease rounds will be worked sequentially. Now, let's say that for this hat crown, rather than having that defined line of decreases that we had in the first example, we want the more subtle version. That means that we are going to work the decreases at the beginning of each section rather than at the end. I'm going to work my setup round and then we'll work the first decrease round. So with my setup round, I am only decreasing in every other section. So this first section, I'm not going to do my decreases. And again, it's because I have 8 sections and there's 4 of them that have an extra stitch. So for my setup round, I just work across this first section. I slip the marker, and now I'm going to work my decrease here at the beginning of the section, and then work completely across. And this is just a section that isn't going to have any decreases for the setup round, and so I will just work across, but I will work a decrease at the beginning of this section, etc., all the way for the entire round. And then once I've completed my setup round, then I will work my first official decrease round where I'm working a knit 2 together at the beginning of every section. You may have noticed that there is one other difference between these 2 hat crowns, besides the fact that this one has defined decrease lines and this one is more subtle. And that difference is that this hat is spiraling, the crown is spiraling to the right, and in this hat, the crown is spiraling to the left. And that has to do with where the decrease is positioned. When it is positioned at the end of the section, you're going to get a spiral that moves to the right. When you position the decrease at the beginning of the section, the spiral is going to move to the left. But you are not restricted to just these 2 choices. What you'll see here is that this crown is also spiraling to the left, but we have defined decreases. And that is because the decrease was placed at the beginning of each section. But instead of using a knit 2 together, I used an SSK. So I used a left-leaning decrease at the position where it's going to create a left moving spiral. If I place the SSK at the end of the section is still going to spiral to the right, but it is going to be more subtle. So you do have a choice of what you want to do, but if you don't really care which direction the spiral is moving, then I would suggest using a knit 2 together just because that's the simplest decrease. One of the really nice things about spiral crowns is that you can often maintain a stitch pattern that you established in the body of the hat while you work the crown decreases. I'll be sharing more about how to maintain stitch patterns while shaping the crown in the final video in this hat crown series. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below. If you'd like a copy of the crown planning worksheet, I'll leave a link down in the video description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.